All right. Hello, everybody. This is Kim from Women Against Military Madness and the SCOTA Committee, which is the Solidarity Committees on the Americas. And today we're going to have a report back from our members who have gone to Cuba. So it's going to be a very exciting report back. It's always great when people go to different countries to actually get the truth of what's going on. So, but before we start, I wanted to do the land acknowledgement. Batote is a Dakota word that generally means where two waters come together. The Batote, where Aha Tanka, the river of the waterfall, or Wamka Tanka, the big river, called the Mississippi River in English. The Minnesota Wamka Minnesota River come together is central to the Dakota spirituality and history. Batote is a place that carries a complicated and layered history. In thousands of years, the Dakota people have been in relationship and kinship with the land here. And in the several hundred years since the European settlers colonized the land and that the state of Minnesota now occupies, the United States land seizures were a project of the spiritual destruction that denied the Dakota free and unhindered access to the land that they fundamentally shapes their identity and spirituality. Today, there are 4 reservations that are located within Minnesota, 4 Dakota communities in the southern portion of the state, and 7 Ojibwe communities in the north. WAM pays tribute to the Dakota and Ojibwe. So we invite you to consider the land of which you live and the confluence of legacies that bring you to stand where you are today, particularly through the critical reflection and the conversation of or with your own community. So thank you again for all joining our report back from our Cuba trip. We are a committee, the Solidarities of the Americas, and we formed a couple years ago through WAM to talk about the role of the U.S. foreign policy in military and economic oppression and intervention throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. We are an action-oriented group focusing on the challenging the U.S. hegemonic policies in the region and supporting the right of self-determination for all. And we started to revive the coffee hours that the Resource of the Americas had years ago. It's important to bring information that we can for our neighbors to the south so we can understand what's going on in their countries and to help them live without the U.S. influence or oppression. So today, members of the SCOTA Committee and a member from the Minnesota-Cuba Committee joined a delegation with CodePink to take a trip to Cuba in February. It was called To Cuba with Love because it was over the Valentine's weekend. So it's a travel program to show support for the Cuban people. During this trip, our members were able to visit a few humanitarian projects, including visiting some farms and co-ops. They experienced some of the island's musicians and artists. They toured the medical schools and some of the museums, and definitely Havana itself. They talked with community activists, professors, and students. And so now they're going to share what they've experienced and learned from the wonderful country of Cuba. But first, to get us started, Carla Rahe will show an overview of our trip. And after the video, she will give a little history of the blockade and how the United States still upholds this type of warfare against a country for the past 60 years. So go ahead, Carla.
talk and then you have time to walk around.
I hope you can remember this little detail.
Wow.
About community project.
Wow.
Sí, buenos días. Good morning, everybody.
So there we have a brief overview of our trip. We are also putting longer videos online. Each of the meetings was recorded And although some of the sound quality suffers because of background, you can get a pretty good idea of more in depth of what we did. I'll put the link in the chat and also put a link to our itinerary in the chat. So now I guess I am supposed to talk about the blockade. I have 2 minutes. It should probably take about 2 hours or 2 days. It's been a fact of life for Cubans in all walks of life for over 60 years, February 4th being the anniversary of this cruel and unrelenting sanction regime against Cuba. And it's really difficult to overstate the effect that it has had. And it's one of the things that the Cubans just talk about as the main obstacle to their going forward. It's just, sort of defies your imagination as to the long range and widespread effect the blockade has had, or more politely called the embargo, as the U.S. terms it. And it doesn't just affect Cuba's trade with the U.S. In fact, it enables the U.S. through, the machinations that it's able to bring into effect to fine foreign countries for trading with Cuba. In fact, during the first 6 years of Obama's presidency, there were more fines than ever imposed on foreign entities in Cuba, and to the tune of about $14 billion. Imagine that. And
30 seconds.
Pardon me?
30 seconds.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Well, naturally, I'm not close to covering this topic, but look at some of our videos, read some more, and find out about the blockade and what we can do to oppose it, and maybe put a visit to Cuba in your itinerary.
Thank you, Carla. I know we can definitely have a whole hours talking about this. So next, the speaker will be Marcy Shapiro. Not only in spite of the blockade, Cuba is going through some big changes. So they've not only survived the blockade, but they're moving forward in their society. So here's Marcy Shapiro to talk about some of those big changes. You're muted, Marcy.
Thank you. It is a time of really big change in Cuba, but I think all times in Cuba's history have involved a lot of change. I think of Cuba as a reflective society, a society that looks at what it's doing and decides if they need to make change. Unlike kind of the US, where everything's sort of set in stone, in Cuba, they're able to change the constitution, they're able to make big changes. So the current changes are, again, to update the socialist model, to sustain socialism as a strong, independent, and democratic form of government. So I'm going to talk about sort of several aspects of it. One is popular education and discussion and debate. And I just want to emphasize that all of these changes that I'm going to talk about are rooted in Cuba's idea of having everyone be involved in the discussion. So there is a lot of discussion using popular education, which is a form of involvement of people based on the works of Paulo Freire. And we visited the Martin Luther King Center, which is a great place to visit if you go to Havana, which is very important in the development of popular education in Cuba. Children over 14 are involved in all of the discussions that the country has, and the discussion includes student organizations, workplace meetings, their classroom assemblies. So what are the changes? The changes are new changes in the Constitution, and including decentralization and the development of the revision of the family code. In updating the socialist model, they're adding the following as part of the constitutional changes. One is decentralization to local levels, expanding the non-state sector, which is market-based, some market-based economics. Don't think of it as our kind of capitalism, though. Co-ops, private self-employment, and changes in agriculture co-ops. And they want to make sure that the rule of law is maintained, that they improve what they call popular power, which is their form of government, and reforming state-run enterprises. So just to reemphasize, the socialist state is based on the rule of law, equity, and social equality. A couple of changes in the Constitution. The presidential terms are going for now will be from 2 to 5 years. And there's a president, this is something very different from us. There's a presidential age limit of 60 years old. So think about what that would mean for our last 2 presidents. And they've added the popular vote to elect the provincial governments. Another big area is decentralization, and that's adding more power to local authorities, so local governments decide and administer more. There was a feeling that there had been developed too much centralization within the government, and that they wanted to increase participation. So they're hoping through decentralization that there'll be more local voting and power. And then in the family code, which was originally passed in 1975, and I was there in 1979 and heard about the family code, and people were so excited about it then because it was so innovative. And I kept thinking, wow, this is something so different than the United States. And they handed out these little pink pamphlets with the 1975 family code in it. But now they're revising it. They want to update it to today's culture and life. So it's now called the Code of Families. And one of the concerns about getting support for it is kind of the general machismo culture in Cuba, which is part of its cultural history, and how to make sure that everybody is accepting it. There were 46,000 neighborhood meetings conducted about the family code, and it's just been under discussion and debate by all Cubans. Just to give you a few ideas of some of the things that they're wanting to change is to have more equalitarian marriage, so there's equal share of domestic responsibilities from both partners. There's a change to having same-sex marriage and same-sex civil unions, gay adoption of children, the rights of children, and I have this quote, respectful of the dignity and physical and mental integrity of children and adolescents, so that children really are focused on having rights rather than that kind of parental control that we often see in other countries. Maturing children will have more say in their lives. Grandparents will have more rights with their grandchildren. And it also includes senior citizen rights, deals with gender-based violence, prohibits child marriages, and updates regulations on marriage, divorce, marital property relations, and adoption. And
You have 1 minute.
okay, I'm at the end. Cuba is moving ahead in family policies. And I think it's really interesting that they're moving ahead as we're rolling back, that our policies are rolling back at state levels, and while they're becoming more and more open to new ideas, to changes, and to more egalitarian life within the family. Thank you.
All right. Oh, thank you, Marcy. That was a great overview of what is going on in Cuba and their changes. So next up, and before I introduce the next speaker, I wanted to thank again for everyone that is here today, and go ahead and introduce yourself into the chat. State where you heard about us and heard about the program, and where you're from and how you would like to get involved or what you think of Cuba. And also please ask any questions in the chat, and at the end we'll ask our panelists some of those questions. Thank you. So next up will be Sarah Martin. As you just heard, there's definitely big and exciting changes happening. Another area where Cuba is leading the forefront in the world is dealing with climate change and the environment. Being an island nation, they are definitely more affected with climate change that the industrial capitalist countries have produced. So Sarah will walk us through the information she has learned from the people of Cuba that are leading the way on these matters. So go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you, Kim, and thanks everybody. As Kim said, Cuba is a world leader in dealing with climate change. Their gains and approach are documented in a recently made film called Tarea Vida, which means life task, and that we'll put that in the chat. It was made for and shown at the COP26 in Edinburgh to a standing room only audience. And we highly recommend you take it's a 50-minute documentary, and I really recommend you look at it. Tarea Vida is a national plan involving all levels of government and institutions like schools, but most important, it involves involving the importance of it involves involving the people who, along with the scientists, will decide on the energy sources that are appropriate to where they live, which make the most sense, and at the same time won't harm nature and be sustainable. This will really go into the decentralization program, obviously. And as Kim said, like all island nations, Cuba today is dealing with catastrophic climate change. They used to have 3 or 4 hurricanes a year, but now some years they have to start on the alphabet a second time to name the hurricanes. But in response, Cuba has developed a very effective hurricane evacuation system, which is also used for other catastrophes, and very few people lose their lives. In addition to the hurricanes, temperature and sea levels are rising, and rainstorms, which result in unprecedented amounts of rain, cause severe flooding. The communities who live near and off the sea are constantly threatened.
30 seconds.
Okay, because Cuba is in a climate transition zone, it's not known if it will ultimately become drier or wetter. We spoke with a physicist who has been involved in developing and implementing energy sources in rural areas. Cuba has all it needs to produce its own energy, including plenty of sun and wind, but because of the blockade again, they are greatly hampered. They could make their own solar panels, but because they can't get the materials to make the factories, they can't make all of those. Nonetheless, they put solar panels in 99% of the countryside. Other forms are biomass, biogas, and permaculture. Those are being developed in the countryside also. The cities are oil dependent, but so the key to that is making the buildings more energy efficient. Cuba has a political will to build a society which is sustainable and just. And it's able to do so because it's a socialist system which puts people over profits. We would do well to learn from them. In fact, the future of human life on this planet depends on it.
Thank you, Sarah. That was very interesting. And indeed, while countries are moving ahead, the US is sorely lagging behind and causing most of the damage. So next up, Jairus Heckler will talk about the next important item that's been plaguing our global society for 2 years. And so that, of course, is the COVID-19 global pandemic. And the best thing about Cuba is that their doctors are definitely focused more on health care and prevention than any other industrialized part of the world. They've been on the forefront of coming up with vaccines and treatment to end the pandemic. And they actually have a lot fewer deaths than other countries. So Cuba, and along with others, some of the socialist countries have greatly advanced medical care and is beating COVID. So Jairus will explain more on that topic. Go ahead, Jairus.
Hi, we met with the Ministry of Public Health's Director of Epidemiology, Dr. Francisco Duran. Cuba's Dr. Fauci appeared almost daily on Cuban television and provided accurate information on the current status of their fight against COVID, reporting infections, recovered, deaths, the whole thing. Cuba kept its death and infection rate low, as one of the lowest in the world, and became the first nation in that part of the hemisphere to create not 1, but 5 vaccines, despite the economic and resource limitations that the blockade imposes. One thing about Cubans is common. Dr. Duran in his opening remarks expressed appreciation and the importance of people like us coming from the US to be present and learn about Cuba. Always appreciations. Cuba recognized the COVID health problem and realized it would not be solved by just the Ministry of Public Health. So they involved all the ministries working together. They disseminated vaccines quickly, and the population was not influenced by a campaign against vaccines. Dr. Duran's comment about that translated as absurd. People heeded the advice to stay home. People wore masks both inside and outdoor on the street. We never saw anyone that didn't have a mask on outside, especially outside. I mean, during the treatment process, they determined whether the COVID positive people were a low risk or a high risk, similar to how we determined that. If it was a low risk person, they stayed home, and a higher risk, they went to a hospital, and they developed ICU units in every hospital. There were 449 community clinics in the country, and the doctor and the nurse of the community were seen as the vital, responsible people for not only the people, the family, and the environment. The doctor and nurse would go to the house to give treatment, or people could come to a clinic. Cuba created an app on your phone on which people could record their symptoms. At the start of the pandemic, Cubans had gone door to door and offered 3 doses of a homeopathic remedy called Prevengavi to boost immune system for everyone. Students from the medical schools knocked on doors, asked if anyone had symptoms like joint pain, fever, problems breathing. And as the people improved, the nurse would come to the house every day to check blood pressure and temperature, etc. Cuban research centers and the scientific community worked together, competing against COVID to develop 5 vaccines, not competing against each other to have the first one or the best one or anything. They started with clinical trials. Sarah, our guide, was part of a trial. They put forth 2 vaccine candidates, Abdullah and Soberana, and they did not use one more than the other. The efficacy of both was over 90%. It was more related to production as to who got which one. As we did, Cuba started to vaccinate their highest risk population first. The project was created so that everyone could get a vaccine, and they organized it around the family doctor and nurse offices. They even went into schools and had centers. They kept reiterating how they made it accessible for everyone and easy for everyone and a quick response. After a vaccine injection, people waited an hour to see if there were any side effects. Their blood pressure was checked and temperature. And I don't know about you, but when I had my vaccines, I sat for 20 minutes and nobody monitored me. Most of the pharmacy techs were on their computers. Cuba was also became the first country in the world to vaccinate children aged 2 to 18. They approached the campaign for children as a fiesta for the children. Schools worked with the Ministry of Health, and when schools closed, school was on Cuban television. The teachers sent information on WhatsApp to see what the students and families needed. They did not close daycare centers. Cuba is currently working on a vaccine for children aged 7 months to 2 years. Pregnant women had the vaccine, and the baby is considered protected until age 7 months. All Cubans have had at least one vaccine. Some have had even a 4th vaccine.
1 minute.
Despite the blockade, Cuba has created 5 vaccines and vaccinated over 93% of its population with limited resources and limited economic means. Cuba developed a plan to care for all of its citizens affected by COVID and disseminated vaccines to its people as quickly as possible. Cuba is currently following the procedure to register their vaccines with the World Health Organization. And because Cuba is Cuba, we know they will start medical brigades to bring vaccines to developing nations as soon as they can. Thanks.
Thank you, Jairus. Okay, so moving right along, we also have to talk about the food of Cuba. And from the blockade, there has definitely been setbacks, but some gains. So Simon Elliott will speak about that. So go ahead, Simon.
Hello, thank you. And thank you to everyone who is joining us today and in the future to watch this. So yeah, one thing, and I think, this point was made earlier is, Cuba has achieved a lot of things, but Cuba's also, it's not a utopian society. And when you arrive, one thing that you notice, or I noticed, is there are lines. When you land in Havana, there are places where people are standing in lines. And you quickly discover that oftentimes the longest lines are for rationed chicken. And, that obviously to the right wing, they like to jump on that. And that's, an anti-communist argument about as old as time. But when you learn a little bit more about why there are those lines, because chicken has to be rationed because of US aggression, it really helps to put it all into context. So one thing we did get to do, which I really appreciated, is we got to go to an agricultural cooperative outside of Havana, and we had the opportunity, I believe he was like a vice minister of the Ministry of Agriculture joined us, as well as representatives from the Asociación Nacional de Agricultores Pequeños, ANAP, which is like the National Association of Small Farmers. So we did get a chance to talk to them about people from the commune, about how the commune works, which I'd love to have more time to talk about, but we're all short here and Kim's being good with the timer, so I won't. But it is a beautiful communities where they have built their own housing, they've built their own health clinics within the community, and they run it all collectively, which is a beautiful model.
Yep. 30 seconds.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to really briefly, with the time remaining, talk about, so the chicken, using the example of chicken again. The Cuban government has decided to ration chicken And part of that reason is because it provides a base level sustenance for families and for Cubans across the country. But the example of chicken is very interesting because a lot of the chicken comes from the US, but the way in which chicken has to get to Cuba from the US because of the blockade is interesting to look at briefly. So the US does not, because of the blockade, Cuba cannot buy products like chicken on credit. So they have to pay cash before the ships will leave the dock, leave the port in the US. So Cuba has to somehow gather hard currencies. And Kim, I promise I'm almost done. Has to gather hard currencies such as dollars or euros from things like tourists, people like tourists, and then send it to Europe to buy euros, and then it comes back to Cuba, and then Cuba then has to ship it to the US, and it has to be received by the chicken producers before the chicken will leave the port. So you can just think about, instead of how global trade, according to the capitalists, is supposed to work in this free market system, the cutting off of credit really restrains access to trade, and chicken is just one good example of that.
Okay, thank you, Simon. And then up next, how Cuba is also different from the US is the Cuban police force. So Marcy will give a short presentation on all of that. All right, whoops. There we go.
Now, okay. So one of the things when we with the group we were in, over half of us were from Minnesota and Minneapolis. And so when we introduced ourselves as being from Minneapolis, people immediately knew about George Floyd and started talking to us about the George Floyd murder, and were in shock that such a thing could happen in the United States or anywhere in this country. In Minneapolis, so it's, they think of Minneapolis as the place that George Floyd was murdered. And so it was interesting for us to be able to talk to them about, how the police deal with situations. And so I just wanted to mention a few things. One is there are no police that you can see in tourist areas. There's no guns. Cubans don't have guns. There's not gun violence in Cuba. It's a whole different feeling than we have in the US. One of the things, I've been to Cuba a number of times, and one of the things I've always thought when I'm there is I'm safe here. I don't have to worry about somebody shooting me. I don't have to worry about somebody attacking me. It's a safe place for women to walk around without thinking that they'll be attacked or that anything will happen to them. So I think it's really important to understand that the role of the police is there, but there's a lot of police that ride bicycles, and there's, it's a much quieter kind of policing than we have in the United States.
30 seconds, Marcy.
Okay. Oh, so what I really wanted to do was talk briefly about one of the people I met who's a lawyer was telling me about when he knew about George being from Minneapolis. He wanted to tell me about a domestic abuser that had just happened, who was very violent, who was attacking his wife, was going to try to kill her. And the police came to their house, and instead of shooting him, they talked with him for 3 hours straight until he calmed down, till he gave up his gun, till he was willing to give himself in, and no one was hurt in the situation. So a different scenario than we would see in the US, where action happens quickly they tend to want to use discussion as a way to resolve issues. Thank you.
Well, that's great. That's definitely a step up than what our police force does here in the US. So next, Simon's going to be up again. People might have heard about those anti-Cuban government protests back in July of 2021. There was a series of protests against the Cuban government and the ruling of the Communist Party, which was triggered by food shortages in medicine and the government's response to the resurgence of the pandemic. But there's always something behind this story, and it's not what you think. And Simon will discuss what really happened. Simon?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. I mean, it is hard to say what really happened, but what we do know for certain, and we did have an opportunity to talk to some people who had witnessed the July 11th protest, but what we do know for certain is that July 11th, the US's response to it really marked a change. Like there had been some discussion of maybe a return in the Biden administration to more Obama administration era kind of warming to Cuba, restaffing the embassy, doing those sorts of, necessary steps for any sort of improved relations. And after July 11th, that completely changed and the Biden administration slammed the door to that. So I will say that it's interesting to listen to people in Cuba talk about the protests, because I think that they acknowledge that there were some real frustrations and there was some real kind of there was spontaneity in the demonstrations. But they also expressed that there was an undercurrent, there was a level of violence, and we heard this from multiple people, a level of violence that is just not seen in Cuban protests. There are countries in Latin America which have well-documented histories of violent protests, very militant protests, and Cuba is not one of those countries since the revolution. So it was very shocking to a lot of people, I think, seeing damage done to grocery stores, damage done to gas stations. And I'm actually going to place in the link, the July 11th protests and framing them properly are really important. So there's a great event that was done shortly after called Let Cuba Live. And they're talkers that are, speakers that are much more eloquent than I am talking about the context of the July 11th protests. But it is important to note that those violent elements, there is evidence that the US was paying for a lot of the damage to be done, was paying protesters to engage in smashing windows of these grocery stores that had been set up to capture hard currency, attacking gas stations, and that there was a certain amount of money that was given per action. And there's actually the Cuban government, after the fact, did release some documents that were proving that channeling through USAID, there was actual bounties per action that people could collect. But also what's important to note is someone that we had a chance to speak to was part of the, I wouldn't say pro-government, but pro-socialist revolution demonstrations that came out on July 11th and ended up kind of taking back the streets. The way in which the violence had kind of broken out in the street took a lot of people by surprise. But it was, for me, just inspiring to hear that within hours, the streets had kind of been taken back over by peaceful pro-socialist revolution Cubans. And so I'm going to put this link in the chat to hear if people want to get some more context, which I think was a great event. But yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you, Simon. So next, Sarah will be talking about the tours that they went on. I've heard a lot about the museums that they loved loved to go to and got to tour, and some of the Cuban people and how we were received on our visit. So go ahead, Sarah.
And actually, what I'm going to say is that this is a really important time to go to Cuba. It was important when we went, but I urge all of you, if you're considering a trip to Cuba or to anywhere, pick Cuba, because I promise you, you will be inspired by what you see, and you will love Havana in Cuba. But equally as important, maybe more important, is it's an incredible act of solidarity and in opposition to this horrendous blockade. There aren't many tourists there now. People that have been there on our group who've been there many times talked about really how empty the streets were. And tourism had developed into one of their biggest industries, and because with cruise ships and everything. But of course, COVID put an end to a lot of that. So it's, and they depend on the money, obviously, to fund these, and the money goes to funding these incredible gains that for the people in healthcare and in environmental areas, whatever, schools. So it's your political duty to get yourself to Cuba as fast as you can. And as I said, I promise you won't be disappointed. I'm not going to go through all you got a good sense of that from the video of the kind of places we visited. And as Carla said, if you go to the WHAM YouTube channel, you can actually hear, it's really good stuff. Many of the lectures are excellent, and you'll learn a lot about Cuba and what's going on. So I encourage you to do that to get yourself ready for your trip to Cuba. So, and also on our SCOTA page, Carla is posting all the time upcoming trips, because there are many trips now being planned to go to Cuba. A big one coming up is the May Day. May Day is International Workers' Day, is a huge day in Havana, as it is in all around the world. And we're making it a big day here in Minneapolis, but that's a particularly fun time to go. But any time is a good time to go to Cuba. So, and people would say to me before I left, aren't you afraid to go to Cuba? And I would say, to get to Cuba, I have to go through the most dangerous place in the world, and that's the Miami airport. But once I get to Cuba, I'm in the safest place in the world. So don't be afraid.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. So the next up is not only touring Cuba, but when you go to Cuba, you'll be able to visit lots of places, do more cultural things. And so Simon will be up next, followed by Joe, because they definitely have a lot to say about the culture in Cuba. So Simon?
Yes. So this was my first trip to Cuba, and I was going with a lot of hardened Cuba travelers, solidarity travelers. So for me, the part that I really appreciated, and when we were planning this event, I asked to speak about this, was just the different cultural events that were interspersed throughout our trip. We were doing very formal meetings and learning about the state response, such as with Dr. Duran, the health ministry. But then we interspersed that with things such as there's this one very short street, it's not even 2 blocks, called the Callejón de Jamel, where we learned a lot about what we know as Santeria. And we got to also learn a little bit about some of the cultural projects that they, including an artist that just passed away recently, did in order to kind of revitalize that little area, and also to pay tribute to the African roots of a lot of people in Cuba. I don't want to just rattle things off, but I'll name a couple highlights for me. One of them was the Museum of the Denouncement, Memorial de la Denuncia, which is a beautiful museum. It's top of the art, and what it is it basically tracks all of the attempts by the US and denounces all the sabotage, the terrorist attacks, the assassinations, the blockade, the media warfare, the disinformation that's spread against Cuba. And I found that museum to be, really powerful. I think we all can appreciate the depth of depravity of the US foreign policy establishment and what they've done for decades, but to see it all there in a museum laid out, like I would love to be able to bring that museum here to the US so people can kind of see and be confronted with the legacy of what their government does with their tax dollars and in their name. So there's the Museum of the Revolution, which is incredible, which I recommend. And then there's also the Fidel Castro Center, which if you have gone to Cuba in the past, I think that this alone is a reason to make another trip. It opened, I think, just in this fall. And as a museum, it's obviously in Fidel's honor. But before he passed, he asked that nothing be named after him, no streets, no plazas, no universities, no institutions, with one exception being that there could be one like research center basically, or that could carry his name. And it's interesting, they have now in there, they have a publishing company, the museum, obviously, photo exhibits, etc., all in the Fidel Castro Center. And then, yeah, just I really, it's a beautiful country. You may have seen when you joined the Zoom room, there was a picture of mosaic depiction of the Granma, the boat that the Che and Fidel and the Cuban revolutionaries took from Mexico to Cuba at the beginning of the revolution. And that is this incredible neighborhood that is an artist named with the last name Fuster, who started, it seemed, doing kind of Picasso-like mosaics in his home and obviously selling them as an artist, but has since expanded and started to just cover the entire neighborhood. And it's just beautiful to see an entire neighborhood that is just popping with color and beautiful mosaics. So I would like to continue talking, but I also know I need to cede some time to Joe to talk about trips that he's been on and some other things that Joe has been involved in.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Go ahead, Joe.
In January, I was fortunate to go on a trip to Cuba with a group led by Nachito Herrera, who's a Cuban pianist who now lives here in Minneapolis and performs frequently at the Dakota nightclub downtown. In January, he was a headliner at the Havana Jazz Festival, and he chartered a plane from Miami, invited some people he knew, including an invitation to people from the Minnesota-Cuba Committee to join him in Havana for a week. And among the other guests were two people from the humanitarian group Matter, which is based here in Twin Cities. And they brought along 2 plane loads of medical supplies, a huge amount. The way that they obtain these materials is mostly by collecting surplus materials that are going to be thrown away by medical institutions. And our departure from Miami was delayed for about 5 hours, apparently, because of a work slowdown by Cuban American airport workers who didn't like all that material going to Cuba. In Cuba, on the other hand, Nachito got a hero's welcome. Cuban press were lined up waiting on the tarmac. Nachito performed at the opening night and closing night concerts of the festival. And the closing night concert included working with an orchestra as well as a jazz band, and it was attended by Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel. A couple other highlights of the trip. We visited the Foreign Ministry, where we heard from Vice Foreign Minister Carlos de Cosio and Joana Tablada from the North American Department of the Foreign Ministry, both very dynamic spokespersons. Also, I was able to get together with Cuban filmmaker Gloria Rolando, who has worked with people in the Twin Cities for many years. And you can check out some of her films on YouTube. I'll mention two. Eyes on the Rainbow, which is a documentary about Assata Shakur, a former Black Panther Party member, falsely accused and wrongfully convicted of killing a policeman. She escaped from prison and was granted political asylum in Cuba. And you may recall that in 2016, the US was demanding her extradition when they were negotiating with Cuba. And this was also demanded at speeches at the Republican convention. Another film of hers I would particularly recommend is 1912, a film about a civil war in Cuba in that year, after Afro-Cuban veterans of the War for Independence formed an independent Black political party, and as a result faced a war of extermination by the pro-US regime. Gloria helped me with contacting the Cuban Film Institute, EKITE, and we delivered some discs and other materials for her current project. And talking with her, she mentioned that the July 11th anti-government protest had come right down her little street. And she said it was about 1,000 people, mostly young people. She also mentioned that the US government was not accepting the Cuban COVID-19 vaccine for entry into the US. And I also got to meet her sister, Araceli, who, like Gloria, is a force of nature. And lastly, we want to encourage people to visit Cuba. On both of these trips, it was dramatic to me how few tourists we saw. Perhaps people are worried about Cuba, COVID, I don't know. But as Sarah was saying, Cuba is one of the safest places you can go. Everyone down to children 2 years old is vaccinated, and they wear masks. There's no anti-vaccine campaigns there. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe, and all for our presenters today. So as you can see and hear, that there's lots of things going on in Cuba, and it's a great place to visit. So we always ask, what are our tasks to support the Cuban people and the country? Well, there's many ways in this period. There's many ways to show that Cuba no longer stands alone. That's the important thing. And throughout these past years, there's more people organizing to bring awareness of Cuba, in particular, against the blockade. So here in the Twin Cities, what you can do is join our committee, SCOTA. And I will put links in the chat in a moment. So we have Friday morning meetings every Friday. So come bring your enthusiasm and your ideas, and to bring out more about Cuba. Also, Joe, who we just heard from, is part of the Minnesota Cuba Committee. And I'll put a link in there too. You can definitely go to their meetings. And another physical way to help bring awareness of Cuba and the blockade itself is to join the SCOTA and Minnesota Cuba Committee's car caravans. It started in Miami with some Cuban Americans that want the blockade to end. They started gathering, doing car caravans in the city, and it's spread throughout actually the United States and parts of the world. So at the end of every month on a Sunday, we have car caravans. This April 24th will be at 1 p.m. in Minneapolis. We're gathering at South High School, and I'll definitely put links on there too. So we all agree that solidarity work is important. So the best thing you can do at this moment in time is to go to Cuba. Bring your friends, your family, bring some money, support the Cuban people and the businesses, and just get a feel for what another country is like. It's always important to go outside of our comfort zone of our own country. And then Carla, if you want to put a link to the itinerary of what the travel, the trip was all about. There's lots of things to do, so there's no shortage of being bored in Cuba. There's many trips planned by many different groupings. You could visit our Facebook page to kind of get a rundown of when and where. And the other thing that we're doing as a committee is that we're writing resolutions for not only our perhaps city governments, state governments, and the federal government to support the Cuban people ending the blockade. And we actually wrote some resolutions that our Senator Sandy Pappas was headlining to work in collaboration with the Cuban doctors during the pandemic and letting the Cuban doctors come to the US. And of course, calling your Congress people. We have to force them to do the correct thing. And the only way they will do it is by the force of our grassroots work and the people, because they're supposed to be working for us. But they still need to be put pressure on. So there's lots of things to do, depending on the time that you have and what you would like to do. There's many ways. So that's the end of our presentation. We would definitely like to open it up to the folks that have been listening to ask questions, a couple of comments. If you'd like to go to Cuba, we can set you up.